Greetings, folks. This is Summer here from Albuquerque, New Mexico. This video comes in response to Hillary Clinton's recent speech denouncing the alt-right. Here I'm going to illustrate how both the Clinton campaign and the alt-right are scams. I'll be focusing on the alt-right. And this video is targeted at folks who identify as being on the alt-right or alt-right curious, flirting with the alt-right, and so on. So if you're already an anti-racist anarchist, there's not going to be a whole lot here for you. No surprises, I imagine. I hate that I have to add that adjective to anarchists. Anarchism should be anti-racist, anti-colonial, queer, feminist, and so on by default. Unfortunately, that's not the case. My inspiration for making this video was how I ran into a person who identified as an anarchist, a anarcho-capitalist, at a protest of military recruiters and CIA recruiters. And this person ended up being a supporter of Donald Trump and was spouting a lot of white racialist, white nationalist talking points. So that got me interested in the alt-right and in refuting the alt-right's arguments. And then Clinton's speech came right as I was in the midst of this. So that's the background for the video. So to begin with, the Clinton campaign. So as I'm denouncing the alt-right, not doing so from the same perspective as Clinton. I see Clinton as a representative of the status quo interests, the sort of global economic system, sometimes called neoliberalism, that is bad for the majority of the species. So instead, I encourage freedom, revolution, anti-capitalism. And with Clinton, I feel confident that there's that traditional element of duplicity that Clinton's not necessarily even believing. The sort of propaganda she uses, it's all about maintaining power. With the alt-right, sometimes they sound like true believers. So perhaps it's not a scam in that sense. Maybe they've tricked themselves, though I suspect many of them are just in it for the typical pyramid scheme dynamic that comes out of community. So the first amusing and disturbing thing that strikes me about the alt-right is how they turn their backs on the best parts of the European and Western tradition broadly defined, while claiming they're returning to their traditions, or honoring their ancestors, and so on. The best part of Western thought, if that's a meaningful term, is that tradition of criticism, of not just taking tradition, the past, for granted, and of course the scientific spirit of empiricism, of producing useful knowledge rather than just regurgitating what's been told to us. So I see science, individualism, and anarchism as these elements of the Western tradition that the alt-right, white nationalists, and so on reject. So even when it comes to honoring Western thought, they're not doing a good job. And here I have some examples of what I consider representatives of this positive side of the Western tradition. So we have, of course, Michel Foucault. We have Shulamith Firestone. And we have Judith Butler. So as far as science goes, the ways the alt-right turns its back on science are myriad. the problem with the sort of the 21st century race science that the alt-right supports is that all of its claims are dubious because race in the popular conception is not real, or at least there's no good evidence for it. Genetics are real. We got pretty solid evidence for that. It hasn't been the sort of complex relationships between what you see out in the world and society, and even in an individual human body. Even that connection with genetics, with genes, is not 100% firm. There's still so much work to do and is being done. But I feel fairly confident saying that genes are real. But these ideas about the popular major races, white, black, Asian, so on, these do not map meaningfully to genetics. They're not particularly useful markers. And of course, they have a history of horrors, basing social relationships on these more or less arbitrary racial divisions. So the alt-right fails right there when you look at their claims about science and supposedly being scientific. They're not really part of the proper scientific tradition, not properly empirical. And thinking about individualism is one of the prominent things coming out of the Western tradition, though of course, as with science, coming from lots of different places as well. Individualism shows that even if the dubious claims that folks on the alt-right make about intelligence and race, even if those are true, it doesn't really matter, because what difference does it make if members of a certain populations are have a higher tendency to this or that, right? That's not doesn't say anything about the individual. These sort of broad population survey numbers. If you're an individualist, if you actually care about individuals and fostering the freedom of individuals, then the sort of the IQ is lower and there's the crime rate's higher and all these things that certainly don't simply map to genetics, but even if they did in some magical fantasy world, still wouldn't really matter because it's all statistical, and individuals still have to be respected as individuals. So if you believe in individualism, if you believe in freedom, the alt-right fails yet again. So, as I said, not even doing a good job of honoring the Western tradition, and I'm not even sure that's a worthwhile project. As I said, the best thing about the Western tradition, about Western thought, is that it turns on itself. It's that it refuses to keep those idols, refuses to keep those traditions. It's all about finding the truth about the material world as best we can, the truth about the best way to satisfy human and hopefully non-human desires as well. So that gets me to the sorts of claims about anti-white discrimination that folks on the alt-right make. So the major issue here is understanding history, understanding social power as existing in structures, and keeping things in perspective. So just looking at it empirically in the United States, and you all can see similar trends if you look globally in terms of wealth distribution, right? White folks in the United States, those who bear that social marker, check that box in the census categories and so on, are not hurting when it comes to wealth, right? Comparatively, of course, white families have their median wealth is 10 times or so, many multiple times. The exact number depends on which study you look at. The average or the median household wealth of black families and Hispanic families, again using those census terms. So empirically, the idea of anti-white bias of whites as a oppressed group is laughable. So the only claims that are vaguely align with material and social reality. With regards to anti-white discrimination, are those cases of people maybe being unjustly fired over saying something racist, but that was kind of innocent, like white people say all the time. And the alt-right presents this idea that white people can never say anything racist or make any jokes, then they'll immediately be fired. And you do see occasional cases of this, but I don't know, maybe unless there's some sort of areas that are very different from the ones I've experienced, and I've grown up around a lot of white people, have lots of experience with that, my family and so on. White folks do racist things all the time with minimal social consequences, no financial consequences. So that argument does not match my experience. Again, there are those those specific cases, and certainly sometimes you could say that those identity politics and political correctness do become ends in themselves in unproductive ways. But when you keep that in perspective, it's not terribly relevant, because you have folks sympathizing with Black Lives Matter get arrested for posting on Twitter and so on, or posting on Facebook, whatever. And so there's hardly an empirical case for anti-white discrimination as some major social problem. To the contrary, if you look at history and think about white supremacy coming out of European colonialism as a specific social structure, there's little question that the idea that these sort of claims of white injury are in fact just reactions to the eroding white supremacy. And the way white supremacy is eroding is it's being folded into this sort of multicultural white supremacy, where it's not explicitly about whiteness anymore, unlike how it was in the United States, of course, for so long. But similar sorts of privileges are tacked on to the idea of multicultural subjects and citizens and multinational corporations, the global financial elite, and so on. And sometimes folks not classified as white are included into this, but it's particularly about the sort of white liberals or enlightened white multicultural subjects. That's who gets privileged. And I think the Clinton campaign really illustrates that. So I see movements like the alt-right and white nationalism as a reaction to this change in the structure of white supremacy. It's not that the white race is under attack. The white race doesn't exist except as a social category, as a club of privilege. But it's not that that's under attack in the United States. It's just that it's morphing. And poor and working class white folks are, presented as the enemy in this system, as they to some extent have been in U.S. history since the beginning. But there's always been that bargain between the white elites and the white working class, where you have the psychological wages of whiteness, where the idea of racial difference makes organizing the working class and organizing against hierarchy of the existing elites and business and the government. That's how they maintain their power. So that's what this is really all about. And regardless of whether folks like Jared Taylor and so on, all these alt-right heroes, regardless of whether they actually believe what they're telling you, it's essentially a scam. Unless you're rich or you feel like you're magically going to win the social capitalism game, the popularity context. Spoiler alert: you're probably not going to. But unless you think you'll magically come out on top in these pyramid schemes of the new communities that white nationalists and alt-rightists are trying to set up, you're just going to end up getting screwed over by them. It's not going to help you. Those kind of politics could quite plausibly, actually lead to what you see in fascism, right? These heightened nationalism, and even alt-rightists say, they're not for war, they're against war and imperialism and so on. They're for isolationism. Nationalism is all about conflict, and especially European style nationalisms. Just look at the recent world wars. So that's the kind of society where the alt-right is headed. So instead of that, I advocate for anarchism, for freedom, that good Western and universal value. So people of color aren't your enemies. The liberal elites are your enemies, definitely. No question about that. I mean, some of them are okay, but in general, they are just maintaining the status quo. So all of that anger is well placed, but it's not immigrants or black folks, Black Lives Matter protesters, and so on. They're not they're not your enemies. It's all the people that hold power, the people who maintain the access to nice things. These are the enemies. And anybody who tells you otherwise is trying to trick you, and it's going to end up hurting you in the long run. So if you've been sympathizing with the alt-right, get out of there, do the actual research, read about history of how race has been constructed in the United States and across the world. Read the actual history and the history of racial science and the current genetic science, and come over to the club. Anarchism's a great place. It's the sort of anti-community, and the revolution's going to happen. You want to be on the right side. So there it is. Both Clinton and the alt-right are scams. Don't fall for either. Reject all the bosses, the rich, and the governments. Long live anarchy.